As most countries were modernizing, countries like Turkey were still ways behind on the road towards modern technological warfare. Czechoslovakia mainly focused on steel production, of which the majority was used by the USSR itself. Where Poland started a 3-year plan, North Korea's Kim Il-sung embraced his alleged first 5-year plan to recover its country's economy, implying more plans would be occurring in the future as well. At the end of the 1951, tensions between the Kingdom of Jordan and Palestine rose to the point where war was declared. NATO and Europe decided to stay out of the conflict. In Britain, Churchill's government decided to expand the BBC. It was done under the motto to bring the world news faster and more direct to its people. But some skeptics were of the opinion that this decision was made to increase the spying capabilities with the newly built radar sites. The Republic of Finland was shivering. Anti-communist support kept on growing on the streets, and the government set forth pressure towards keeping neutrality under Soviet pressure, as they were afraid of an anti-communist local clash would erupt in a Soviet invasion once more. As it became 1952, West Germany continued its reconstruction, both from World War II and its Civil War. MacArthur, who still refused to give up Japan to its locals, set forth a focus on their battleship effort to keep patrolling the seas alongside Russia and Korea. With Truman's issued McCarran Internal Security Act being a major success, Truman thought it was time to boost the national spirit with a mobilization against the USSR. Though these were words of aggression, it was not a war declaration. It was merely a propaganda movement on convincing the people of the possible threat that might occur in the Western-labeled free world. With the anti-communist movement getting a boost from the Security Act, the mobilization bared fruit as many more Americans signed up for the army. In China, that was still being dominated by civil war, Mao and Czech returned to a status of a stalemate, since it was now clear that things started to turn against the communist forces. After Churchill had secured his political position with the healthcare, he set forth a focus on improved research, as he sensed the period of turmoil around the corner. Britain could greatly benefit from an increased rate of research. Finland still had its hands full, trying to be careful not to set off a conflict with the neighboring Soviets. It was no secret that many Finns did not share love for communism, but the government was afraid that anti-Soviet media would anger the Soviets and therefore started to censor these productions. As calmness had returned in West Germany, other countries like Italy saw an opportunity in investing in the state, as the rebuild would bear financial fruit in the future. Poland continued its road down the path of modernization under supervision from the Soviet Navy. In the second half of 1952, the Chinese Civil War was still going on without an end in sight, with both factions losing and winning every other week. In America, Truman agreed to increase social security as paranoia on the Red Danger spread through local towns and communities. If the common folk felt more secure, it would benefit America as a whole when it came to work output. With West Germany still in ruins, the most important factor first was to create a good infrastructure to lead everything smoothly for a quicker build-up. One step of this was the creation of the Grand Autobahn. By October, the French volunteers fighting for Czech had spearheaded to the eastern coast, but were now cut off from their reinforcements. Though the situation might seem dire, their equipment and ammunitions were still plentiful to hopefully re-establish the connection. Mao's armies had now significantly been pushed towards the east, making it more plausible for Chiang Kai-shek to win. The American 1952 election resulted in the winning of Adlai Stevenson, whose first move was the issue of MacArthur still holding control over Japan. Stevenson wanted to continue what Truman set in motion, as America could keep an eye on the Soviets from the opposite side. Britain continued to expand its research capabilities, not only out of fear for nuclear development in the coming years, but also the possibility of a new war breaking out very soon. Though Britain had invested in nuclear research, Churchill thought it was time to take the next step to make their bombs more powerful to remain a dominant position over the communists who were undoubtedly doing the same thing. In China, France managed to re-establish the connection with the other armies, and now were Mao's armies that were in trouble as their forces were cut off. Czech focused on fighter support to push the enemies back, as they could not keep up with the demand in armor and planes, even if they were being supplied by the Soviets. Soviet leader Stalin had passed away, and it was up to Nikita Khrushchev to take over the reins. He first focused on infrastructure, to make sure he did not make a too aggressive approach towards the West, whose eyes were always so fixated on the Russians. Stevenson continued with baffling decisions like the Brennan Plan. Stevenson convinced the Americans that more manpower would be needed to face such a threat as communism, to the point where a population increase was set in motion. As 1953 rolled by, new technologies in weapons and armor could be felt, like Britain issuing the implementation of the Humber Pig, as did Britain increase their coastal defenses as a precaution. The Chinese Civil War was just strolling along, the French volunteers now heading down south, dominating the speed as much as they could, given their small number of troops. Mao's factories were destroyed, his troops exhausted, the morale diminished. And then in June of 1953, Mao capitulated, and the Republic of China came out victorious. With Chiang Kai-shek winning over the communists, a slur of anti-communist sympathies rushed over the European citizens. Because of this, an uprising in East Germany was unleashed. Protests in East Germany were reported by the West Berlin-based radio in the American sector. The workers in factories around East Germany stopped working and went on strike for democratic reforms and a reunification with West Germany. The East German and Soviet armies soon fought the protesters. It was an uprising that was doomed to fail from the very beginning. Churchill once again used the civil wars in Germany to his advantage to move towards a military path, and within 2 weeks, the rebellion in East Germany had been laid to rest, as no rebellion could stand up against the Soviet army. Instead of going after nuclear power himself, Khrushchev wisely shoved this towards neighboring Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. Britain's nuclear power started to grow with the recently implemented shifts towards research. They currently had 3 bombs at their disposal. They also started to implement the helicopter, a move that America had already preceded them in by 3 years. In Asia, things were stirring. After Mao had lost in China, the Soviets had found their new puppet to be controlled and guided towards a new war in the form of North Korea. In the end of October 1953, North Korea invaded South Korea as war was declared. Kim Il-sung's armies were, off the record of course, supplied by the Soviets in a battle that they hoped would be easily won by North Korea. South Korea's leader Syngman-dae was still in the process of a focus on citizen rights and was surprised by the attack, though of course the border between the two regions had always been well protected. For the first days, the battles only occurred around the border without too much movement happening. Though there were no official documents proving that North Korea was being supplied by the Soviets, the American government were convinced that this was the case and would try to get evidence in hand in order to justify sending troops over to help South Korea. After a week of fighting, the South Koreans had made some progress on the left flank as they were able to head up north. But even though they were able to gain more territory, it did cost them more troops, as the South Koreans lost 9,000 men of their own. France, who was eager to send volunteers once again after a successful campaign in China, made the grave mistake of authorizing the migration of troops before evidence could be found of Soviet intrusion with the current war at hand. As a result, France was banned from NATO. Stevenson continued to not impress the people with his rash decisions. The irony was that a mere 4 days later, the Soviet Union bluntly got involved in the war, giving the members of NATO the green light to start sending troops towards Korea. Though the war that was fought introduced new types of vehicles and weapons, for the most part, it still had a very similar feeling to that of World War II. Battles were fiercer and deadlier, as technology showed a glimpse of what was to come in future warfare. Both armies clashed, and Britain sent in their troops as well. The war only lasted for a short time, but its battles were intense, leaving destruction, death, and decay in its wake. At the end of November, rather than destroying the whole country, a white peace was signed between the two Koreas. An armistice agreement was signed between North and South Korea with the US. The Korean Armistice Agreement states that the new border was based on the Kansas line where fighting last happened. There was now a 250-kilometer DMZ zone on the border. The two warring nations signed a ceasefire and fighting had stopped. The Korean War seemed to cool down, and now the two sides were claiming victory, even though it was a status quo. It was now calm in the Korean Peninsula. With the world's gaze now shifting towards the Soviets, Khrushchev set in motion propaganda in the city areas, as these were the most important areas to keep a firm grip of. With France being ousted from NATO, its citizens felt cheated and betrayed, giving way for a new, fiercer government to rise. Instead of showing remorse for their actions without reconciling with other NATO members, the French smelled blood, especially after America got involved in the war 4 days after being kicked out from NATO. France needed a target to showcase their importance to the world. It was obviously not going to be another NATO country, nor a communist one. Neighboring fascist Spain would be the perfect play here, as fascism was labeled the enemy of everyone. The first steps were set in motion for France to unleash a war with Franco. In the beginning of 1954, Britain continued its helicopter development when they got a heated message. The US had decided to ban the UK from NATO as well. American intel found out that over the past couple of months, Britain was heating the situation in Europe to increase world tension behind the scenes. When this came to light, people were infuriated, and it was considered one of the biggest scandals. Some thought it was to lure the communists to make a first move, as Britain was afraid to sit and wait for an attack. But seeing as France was doing fine without NATO, the citizens of Britain soon found their calm, and a military access treaty was made with the French. The British government did not stop scheming behind everyone's back, as an incident was being created as of that moment. But not with the communists, but instead with Franco, giving the French their reason to start a war and showcase the world their importance. The world leaders did not know it yet, but kicking France and Britain from NATO was the first step to the end of the world as they knew it. And then, on the 7th of July 1954, war broke out between Spain and France.